My name is Dejan Jović. I'm professor of international relations at the University of Zagreb and chief political analyst in the office of the president of Croatia. And as you know, the title of this session is the European Union and its peripheries in plural, as you could see. We have a fantastic group of participants combining policy analysts, people who are in official positions, either representing the European Union or being within the structures of the European Union. We also have people who are at the moment dealing with the issues of accession in Serbia and distinguished political analysts and commentators from the whole of Europe, in fact. So let me just first of all introduce our panelists, and then I will say something very briefly about the framework within which I imagine today's discussion will be organized. I must apologize, first of all, for this slight delay for organizational reasons. We believe that we should finish by 1:30. So we still have enough time, I think, an hour and a half for a discussion. It is my pleasure to welcome here, first of all, Mr. Elmar Brok, who is, as you know, chairman of the Committee on Foreign Affairs in the European Parliament. Welcome. And then Dr. Tanja Miščević, who is the head of the negotiating team for the accession of Serbia to the European Union and also an academic colleague at the Faculty of Political Science in Belgrade. Also, here is, it is my great pleasure also to welcome His Excellency Michael Davenport, head of the EU delegation to Serbia, who participated in yesterday's discussions as well. Then we have Professor Dušan Šiđanski, who is a special advisor to the President of the European Commission and well-distinguished professor also of European affairs. I'm also glad to introduce Mr. Persson, who is director of Open Europe. Then we also have Mr. Sinan Ülgen, who is a chairman of the Istanbul-based think tank Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies, and Ivan Krastev, chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia. As you see, we have a big panel. So my request in a way was that we keep our introductory statements and then relatively short, maybe 5 to 7 minutes, and then to open up the floor for a round of discussion involving both discussion among panelists and with the general audience. In terms of marking the space, let me just give a very, very brief, short introduction of the problems we are facing at the moment. I think we need to look at the original objectives or ideals linked with the process of European integration. And it's surprising that perhaps 2 or 3 years ago, maybe we thought that some of these challenges or some of these ideals have now lost their value or attractiveness. But I think in new circumstances, some of them have come back to the forefront of the debate, to the center of the debate. And let me just briefly remind ourselves that the European project was about being the anti-war project. I mean, 5 or 6 years ago, we were thinking, well, war, you know, is it really relevant? And actually, we here in the Western Balkans had a different experience of a war 20 years ago. For us, the anti-war project aspect of European integration has always been an important one. The second one is the aspect of freedom, meaning primarily liberal democracy traditionally. The third aspect was development. European integration is about development, about improving your economic situation. And the fourth is about solidarity, bridging the gap between big and small countries, between powerful and others, between developed and underdeveloped or less developed countries. And this was all based on this idea of the liberal idea of fraternité, égalité, liberté, after all, which is a liberal but also never implemented idea on which the project of European integration has been based. And Europe was also about identity, although this has always been questionable and debatable, but it also had an ambition to be a global power, to be a global actor, particularly in its neighborhood. Now, I think this panel has in its title the idea of peripheries. It's interesting that this concept is coming back somehow. We would imagine that concept of periphery comes from either Marxist or imperialist rhetoric. not exactly from liberal. But it's a question really, it is really interesting that together with the crisis of some of these ideas, such as, for example, of liberal democracy, we actually have reappearance of the concepts that are challenging and that we thought actually were not part of the European project at all in the beginning. There are other challenges as well, such as, for example, the challenge of inequality. Have we eliminated peripheries within the European Union, or are we creating peripheries in the European Union? What about the return of nationalism, which is based also on anti-immigration policies, but also skepticism about the ability of the European Union to attract others, and so on and so forth? What about the global role of the European Union and its influence and impact on the neighboring countries? You know, we discussed some of these global issues in relation with the US, but also with China and Russia. We will continue to do so, I think, in particular with regard to the outside, the peripheries on the outside of the European Union, such as, for example, Ukraine, but also Syria, I think, and Iraq as well in this panel. And obviously, we would be interested in how to reach a proper balance between the European Union and its member states. Now, this is a big task, but I suppose without further ado, with this general framework, obviously we won't be able to say much about all of these topics, but I hope we would offer a good round of introductions for pretty much all of some, or at least some of them here. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Elmar Brok, who will with one small request or a question, if I may. And this is, I wonder really how you see the moment of Europe at the moment, really. So how would you describe, in fact, the position in which Europe is finding itself? Do you think Europe is increasing, enhancing its influence globally? Is it still capable of solving the problems in its neighborhood? Is it still the only game in town for the whole of Europe? Or do you think we are losing actually some of this impact and influence that we wanted to have or we once had?
Thank you very much. I think for sure Europe is not the only master in the house and does not want to be so. And in the Ukraine, we see now that it's in real terms is not. But the European Union overall is a global power in most of the economic fields. What we have to do and what we try to build, latest since the Treaty of Lisbon, since in the last 45 years, is how we can translate our economic power into political language. And here we need certain developments still. The European Union stands for 25–30% of the GNP of this world, 25% of the trade of this world. Is the biggest trading power. All the trade responsibility is with Brussels and not with the member states anymore. It is more than double so big, the share of trade, than the second biggest trader, China. The European Union stands, for example, for 60% of all developing aid of the world. Alone from the EU budget, we give 3 times so much money for non-military preventive foreign aid than the United States of America does. And I think this is an important point to play a role of a peaceful power, a soft power. And this is also based at the European Union, its enlargement program is an important part of that. As I became member of the European Parliament, we were 9 member states. Now we are 28. These 28 states together under the same rule of law, in the same internal market, step by step with the same currency, and under the rule of law in a common Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is legally binding, it creates a situation of a room of peace, freedom, and wealth, as we have never had in Europe. And this way of step by step to combine interest of the member states, that for everyone who wants to leave it becomes too expensive, keep things together. That's the original idea. People forget that the European Union was founded because of 2 reasons. Never war again, never dictatorship anymore. This was the 2 reasons. And therefore, the Schuman plan was to combine coal and steel community. The French wanted to control the German coal and steel industry, that the Germans cannot prepare for war anymore. But they gave the Germans the same right in France. exactly 5 years after the war, which was a miracle. And from that it was growing. And every step, from customs union to internal market and to the joint currency, was always economically a good thing for all the countries, but it had always the reason to make this political goal stronger. And the more countries who could join in that, and especially after the changes in Europe in 1890, it created a greater room of such wealth, peace, and freedom. This is a foreign policy. It's the most successful foreign policy Europe has seen for centuries, I would say. And therefore, the enlargement process and the neighborhood policy plays an important role in that. Therefore, despite all the problems we have, we are clear, and we have said it yesterday clearly again, as we had in my committee the hearing with the upcoming commissioner for neighborhood and enlargement. We have asked now Juncker to change the name, not from enlargement negotiations to enlargement. That is in my letter I signed last night, and in order to give messages also in this region, to give a chance, if countries do this transformation process, the rule of law, democracy, anti-corruption, independence of judiciary and all that, and also do this economic transformation process countries have to do to broaden it. So it's a win-win situation for everyone to broaden this space of peace and freedom and wealth. And therefore we will stick to that. But we make no political compromises on that. There will be no political rebate. Everyone has to do its homework. We as European Union, but also the candidate countries have to do their homework, as it's written in the Copenhagen criteria, to make it, name it shortly. And what is the further on the policy? That eastern neighborhood. The former Polish foreign minister Sikorski has once said, in the east we have European neighbors, in the south we have neighbors of Europe. This gives a difference. All countries in the east have the right after the treaty to apply after Article 49 for membership. Whether they get it is another story. But they have a right to apply for that. And what we want to create is now the rule of law, international law, above the borders of the European Union. And this is now the problem we face at the moment in Ukraine. The Helsinki Accord, which is now OSCE, Budapest Memorandum, NATO-Russia agreement, all that say that the territorial integrity of a country has to be accepted. And what is even more important is that every country has a right to make a choice where to go, with whom to make agreements, treaties, and so on. And that's a difference to the past. Therefore, the word peripheries is, in my opinion, a problem. There's no near abroad anymore acceptable. There is no right in our standing that a big neighbor has the right to rule about a small country. That is Vienna Congress and later. The big countries decide about the borders of the small countries. What we want to do is that everyone is equal. Hello? That everyone is equal, and that everyone sits, whether he's a member of the European Union, at a table, that no decision is taken without him, big or small, so that it's the equality of member countries, but that everyone else can trust the international law around him, and that we do not want to run Europe in a way that the power of a country or a neighbor decides about your future, but that you are safe within the acceptance of international law. And that's our point with Ukraine, that we say that it's a violation of international law, where we do the policy of sanctions, where I hope I have interesting discussions about that question in Belgrade today. And I think, but also on this basis, we have to see that the present situation, also the catastrophic situation in the Middle East, that this will bring the European Union closer together. I would not like to debate whether the sanctions towards Russia are right or wrong. That is not the point. I believe they are right. But I would never have thought a quarter of a year ago that the 28 member countries would be able to have a joint position in climate change. We have a new debate in Europe since a few weeks that we want to have a stronger European security defense policy. We will have a faster development of the question of division of labor, European armies, pooling and sharing, procurement of industrial goods and all that than we thought half a year ago. We had in Newport a discussion about Europe and NATO. Just under the limit of the EU-Russia agreement from '97, we have now a rotation of NATO troops towards Eastern European countries. This has the opinion both in NATO and European Union that there should be no member in the European Union with a lower level of security than the others. But also the so-called periphery should enjoy the same rights and security, quality of security. And I think that's very much important. And we know that in the beginning of the European integration process in the 1950s, the threat from the East, the communist system, was one of the driving forces for this unification process. And sometimes we say in Brussels, in the Place Schuman, we have on one side the monument of Joseph Stalin as one of the founders of the European Union. Vladimir Putin on his way to get a second monument there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. When I was listening to you, there's a question that immediately comes to my mind, but there will be probably time also to discuss it. And this question is, are we maybe idealistic and not realistic enough? I mean, you know, it is fine to say, okay, big countries, small countries are the same and should be the same, and big countries cannot and should not really dictate. But in real world, aren't we actually coming to, are we actually not facing a different situation in which the European Union perhaps cannot now enlarge exactly where it wants because there is an obstacle from a neighboring big power? But perhaps, I don't know if you would like to reflect on this immediately, or maybe we can come in the debate later on. That would be my question, for example, for further discussion.
That is one of the problems why we are, many of us, also strongly in this question. If we give up the right of every nation to make its own decision, we have a problem. We have a problem, and therefore we have to stick to this right as it's written in the Helsinki Accord. And therefore I think it's very much clear that this process of European perspective, EU perspective, which does not mean automatically in the next day membership. It means association agreements, free trade area. It could become to a Norwegian solution, part of the internal market. Who does know that Norway, Switzerland, and such countries, fully member of the internal market, of the Schengen system, all that, have 70% of the acquis communautaire on board. So that is a process. But every country must have the right to go that way or stop it. If, for example, the Norwegians have said, we want not to join finally, we want only this 70% and no more. So that must be still in the sovereign decision of a country.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Miščević, I mean, in the title of our session here, we have this word of peripheries, in a way, reflecting on both peripheries within the EU, probably, and also peripheries on the outside of the EU. You are now very much engaged with the process of accession of Serbia into the European Union. I mean, is for Serbia, or maybe any other further candidate country, this moves up in reality a move from being a periphery outside of the EU to periphery within the EU? And is there any alternative to that?
Well, first of all, it is, as always, my great pleasure to be here for fourth time in different activities and different roles that I play within the Belgrade Security Forum, but I really am one of the witnesses to see the development of the very idea of the Belgrade Security Forum, and I'm grateful for my dear three friends here. I have to admit that I've never feel, and I'm sure I'm never going to feel like this, that Serbia or any other of the Western Balkan country feels like a periphery. Why? Look, one short story from the very beginning of the screening exercises, Brussels, the end of September last year, huge screening, chapter 23, which is the reform of judiciary, fight against corruption, fundamental rights. Mr. Danielson, Director General of the DG Enlargement, starting with welcoming us and saying, we are now starting talks with Serbia, not any longer the third country, but the future member of the European Union. Well, actually, that's it. Third country preparing itself with the help and support of the EU member states to become one of those member states. Does it mean that at the very beginning, you are entering at the same circle of the core integration? Not because it's not possible. Look, there are different concentric circles, was it? I'm looking at my dear professor from the university. We started discussing this early 90s, if I'm not wrong. But the idea of the circles, different type of circles within the level of integration, that does exist. It's really present. So economic and monetary union, it's not the whole integration. Not even the freedom of movement or free movement of people is not completely fulfilled. Actually, there are some countries for which this is not a possibility. Because there is no possibility for them to fulfill all the necessary criteria. But can we consider them to be periphery? No. I mean,
Perhaps Britain.
Sorry?
Perhaps Britain.
Okay, that of course, but you said that, not me. Which is important for all of you to remember. That was Mr. Brok. Because it is extremely, I'm sure it's going to be tweeted immediately. It is extremely important to be realistic, and that is one of the important elements. One issue that you mentioned when you then start speaking about the core ideas of establishment of the European integration from the very beginning in the 50s. The idea of how to secure the peace in Europe, how to develop freedom and the protection of the fundamental rights. That idea still exists. I have to say, the idea is a little bit forgotten within the European Union, but it's not forgotten in the region that I am belonging, that I am coming from. So the Western Balkans sees the European Union not only in its economic power, but in terms of a model. Don't forget that, because this is extremely important. And that's why we cannot consider ourselves to be periphery, but to be someone ready and wanting to learn and to establish itself, to resemble and to be at some point full-fledged member state of the European Union. And is it going to happen tomorrow? No, it's not going to happen tomorrow. And then, of course, it's not going to happen in 5 years' time for any of those countries. And as it couldn't happen for any of the EU member states, it took them 3.5 centuries to reach the level that they are right now. Of course, I'm speaking about the Westphalian order and the situation that they are right now. We don't have 3.5 centuries. We have 20, 30 years to reach there. But if we are considered by the EU or by ourselves as a periphery, then we will miss the point. Then we will explain to ourselves, okay, we are different. We don't want to bother because reforms are extremely difficult. Or we are going to give an argument and excuse for the European Union as well as the member states. Don't bother with them, be fatigued with the further enlargements. And I don't think that something like this is happening right now.
Thank you so much. Will you say that to use the word periphery is politically incorrect or maybe an insult?
No, I do not consider it as an insult, but I really don't consider ourselves to be periphery.
So it's a bad analysis in a way, or not even that?
Analysis that we can accept or not accept, but of course there is I know about the periphery of periphery as one of the additional things for explaining where are we right now for the Western Balkans, but not that I agree with that definition, where are we, what are we doing, and certainly not where are we going.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ambassador Davenport, I mean, we mentioned some of these big ideals of the European Union up at the beginning. Do you think European Union is aware of these major objectives or historical achievements that it needs to somehow fulfill? But do you think the European Union is becoming one international organization which is more technical in its nature, and the whole process of accession is becoming somehow almost disconnected with these values and big ideals?
Thank you for the prompts. First of all, I'd also like to pay tribute to the Belgrade Security Forum and the organizers, and this is also my fourth forum. And I think, you know, actually, you guys are doing as much as, if not more than anybody else, to ensure that intellectually and in terms of the analysis of foreign and security policy challenges, Belgrade is not anywhere near the periphery. You're right at the center of things. But I have to say, you know, the title "Peripheries" did set me thinking about what that means. I noted the tweet that was just up there saying, you know, if Scotland had voted for independence, would they be periphery? Mr. Brok takes it a little further. But geographically, of course, you know, where my grandmother was born on the Western Isles of Scotland, of course, geographically, that's peripheral, just as maybe other parts of the European Union, by definition, geographically. But I think the implication of the term being used in this context is that actually it's not just about geography. It's about development, economy. It's about where you are in terms of the mainstream, where you are in terms of culture and mentality. In that sense, I think that I would argue that nowhere inside the European Union should be regarded as peripheral. The whole, you know, all the member states are central to the future of the European Union, and the future member states are also central. Serbia is also central to the future of the European Union, in my view. And this is not just about security. Rightly, Mr. Brok mentioned security in this context and the equality of security across the member states. But it's also about equality in terms of the ability to enjoy the recognition of the rule of law, the ability to ensure the respect for minorities and fundamental freedoms, as well as to ensure economic development and the space. And there, of course, there are huge challenges. There have been many changes in terms of economic governance over the last few years, chiefly in response to the economic crisis that we've all been experiencing. And there is an effort underway now to ensure that those new approaches, which are frankly still quite experimental inside the European Union, are also given the right sort of attention in candidate countries. There's been a lot of talk of fatigue. Mr. Vučić referred to fatigue in candidate countries. Fatigue is often referred to in terms of the approach to enlargement in existing member states. But I would like just to take this opportunity to say that I think the new Commission, which has come in, will be just as committed to enlargement. I think the fact that Commissioner Hahn, if confirmed by the European Parliament, has got, however you phrase it, has got enlargement right at the center of what he's doing as a top priority. And there will be, I'm confident, when the enlargement strategy is released on the 8th of October, I'm confident that there will be a renewed commitment, and that will be reinforced, I'm sure, by member states at future European councils. The question, I think, when you look at the wider topic of this panel, because it encompasses the neighborhood very much as well, I think the question is about how effective the European Union can be in projecting, in promoting its interests across the wider neighborhood, both southern and eastern. And there the question is about what Stefan Füle is frequently referred to as the transformative power, normally referring to that in the enlargement context. But actually, it's about the ability also of the European Union as a force, a soft force, if you like, within the wider region to promote change and reform. And I think, yesterday, I'm not wanting to repeat what the Commissioner Designate has already said, but he referred to 4 points, because he's been asked to look at this by Mr. Juncker: differentiation, flexibility, and having the right tools, and strengthening joint ownership, especially bringing in the emphasis on civil society, which I was pleased to see. But I think there are 2 other big points that need to be made in this context. One is that the continuing transformative power of the European Union, whether it's within the enlargement context or whether it's in the wider neighborhood context, depends fundamentally on the European Union's own ability to demonstrate that it can change and adapt to meet the legitimate expectations of citizens, to ensure competitiveness in an increasingly challenging global marketplace, to offer the rule of law and security that we've been talking about, but also to pursue not just domestic but also foreign policies which are coherent, understandable, and genuinely pursue European Union interests. And I think I would refer in that context very much to the emphasis which Federica Mogherini has been putting in her recent comments on unity in foreign and security policy on the part of the European Union. But then the second point, if I may, before you cut me off, is around the eastern neighborhood. Of course, the principle must be adhered to that each country in the region has the right to choose its own way forward, its own partnerships and alliances and so on. And the taking forward of the association agreements with Ukraine and Moldova is very much in that context. But I think we must not also lose sight of the fact that Russia will be a fundamentally important partner for the European Union in the future and for European Union member states. And that we need to ensure that we are approaching this in a way which is realistic, on the one hand, about the nature of the kind of partnership that we can have, bearing in mind all the very good points from the previous panel about values or lack of shared values, but to identify where those shared interests, common interests are. There are so many challenges. Iran, we talked about the Middle East, but there are also global challenges of climate and energy, where we need to find that common language. I'm sure that is the right way, and we need to try to ensure that Russia does not perceive the European Union's enlargement or neighborhood policy as something which is designed at Russia's expense in any way.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Šiđanski, here we were talking about Europe as if Europe is united pretty much, and sometimes when we say, okay, Europe needs to project the power to other parts of the region, it appears almost as we assume there is one voice in the European Union. Now, however, I mean, even if we say the European Union is committed to enlargement, it doesn't mean all member states are committed to enlargement. Therefore, we are in a permanent situation that we need to balance between the Europe and member states. How do you see we can actually resolve this problem? I mean, with more centralization within Europe, or with allowing more freedom and independence to individual member states with regard to Brussels?
I would like to thank first the organizer, because I am in Belgrade, where I was born some years ago, and it's a very, very emotional moment for me to be with you. Answer, I will, if you permit me, explain what is the challenge and challenges in the European Union. I heard, of course, the presentation, very good presentations, but they are today dramatic challenges for Europe. It's not so still, it's not so perfect as it appears. I would mention, first of all, that we, from the beginning, had the strategy of Jean Monnet, which was, we have to integrate sector by sector. It's a dynamic process. What we observe today is finished. It's limited. You cannot go sector by sector. It's a slow process. Everything is so accelerated in the global world, so we have to move. This is the first point. The second strategy of Jean Monnet, and was a very good contribution, is the invention of the decision-making, in which you have independent commission, of course not completely independent, but nevertheless, and you have the proposals which are done to the Council, which decides today with the European Parliament. This is what happened in 2008. We abandoned this community process in the most sensible area, Eurozone. Eurozone is functioning by intergovernmental process. And almost all, yes, but you are not so active parliament in the zone, I'm sorry. And the Commission is not available for proposals. She has not this capacity. And this is the contradiction, because you have the Lisbon Treaty, which enlarged the community method, and on the other side, the avant-garde is still behind that. So this is one of the first problems. The second problem by Eurozone, which is really the core today of this Europe, is that Eurozone at the crisis has not responded as it had to be with solidarity. I am sorry to say that the beginning was a catastrophe for many states. You look at Greece, Italy, Portugal, Spain, it's awful what happened. Now I must confess that after some experiences, great powers, because in the intergovernmental process, great powers are dominating. This is the problem. And these great powers, and especially Germany, was evolving. And I remember that 2 years ago, Merkel and Sarkozy said, before the change in France, they said, we have to know that if Euro collapses, then we finished with a European political objective. It's completely out. Secondly, you know perfectly that in history, we never were in the money, common money, or union, without the sovereignty, shared sovereignty in this case. And we don't have it. This is the problem. I think we are now with the question, will we be encouraged to go straight and to make a step toward political union? Even the beginning, opening the door to others, but the beginning in the core. Because even for for example, Eurobonds. The answer was, if we get political union, then we can introduce Eurobonds. What does it mean, Eurobonds? It's to have common projects, common way of dealing with the crisis, and not separately sanctioning different states because they don't respect completely or respect it very badly the rules of the Eurozone. So you have this problem. Second challenge, which I will just mention, is the regional problem. We have emerging regions, and we don't respond to these trends. Not that, yes, you will tell me that Committee of Region, but it's not enough strong. And I remember that Germany proposed, when we negotiated the Maastricht Treaty, Germany proposed to have a Senate for regions. And I think this is one of door opened in the future. We have to think it with the UK, with Spain and other countries, Belgium, which is almost partition. So these are the main problems. The third problem is the external challenge, which is, as you see, 2008 was the fatal, because beginning of the crisis, economic crisis, at the same time, Europe created the Oriental Partnership. I said many times to Barroso, this appears something excluding the Russia. It's an error. You should. And he answered, of course, but I propose to Putin to enter. No, you had to negotiate, to prepare this. It's fundamental. And what is now the effects we have? First, we have sanctions, which are sanctioning against the European Union, in fact, also. You have seen what happened in France and other. We are replaced with Turkey and other exporters, and so on. China is financing banks, and so on and so on. So you have a very serious problem. The first panel, the lady from Amis of Europe, the Friends of Europe, said that she is very enthusiastic about this return of Russia, or turn toward the China and Asia and so on. I think, on the contrary, we are accelerating this movement, and Russia is beginning to have much more relation with the Asia, and so on, and would be much more difficult in the future. Right. So these are my conclusion. Just one word is that we have seriously to think about the reform of the European Union and to promote the federation, European federation, which was the idea Jean Monnet, Denis de Rougemont, Schuman, and so on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Persson, more political union, European federation. Do you agree?
No.
Oh, I knew that.
It's my short answer. I think maybe I was brought in on this panel to be slightly contrarian, and that's, I guess, what I plan on being. But I do actually agree with a fair bit of what you said. I do agree that there's a triple challenge in Europe. But first of all, let me just thank the organizers and congratulate you guys on what so far has been an outstanding, what seems to be an outstandingly well-organized conference. I don't think I've ever been to, on current evidence, such a well-organized conference, so that's quite impressive. But thanks so much for having me. But I agree on your three challenges, Dušan. I think you have a challenge in terms of both the internal cohesion of countries with regions asserting themselves. I mean, the UK, we just had a referendum recently, as you'll be aware of, on whether Scotland should leave the UK altogether, and that was much closer than anyone had expected. And of course, Catalonia has a forthcoming, whatever you want to call it, some sort of referendum, legal stay, non-legal binding consultation, I think is the technical word. And the second challenge, of course, is the cohesion of the European Union itself. So whilst Serbia is keen to come in. Others are contemplating leaving. The United Kingdom will hold a referendum potentially in 2017 on whether it will remain a member at all of the European Union. And we also see parties across the EU that have a more or less explicit anti-EU agenda gaining in the opinion polls. And of course, the final challenge, which has been very much the theme of the morning, is the external challenge with the neighborhood and to what extent the EU can exert influence in the neighborhood. So in light of those three challenges, is the answer more federation in the EU, more political union, more and more integration? And I will say probably not. And the reason I'm saying that is not because I'm less committed to a less committed European than anyone else in the room. The reason I'm saying that is also because it's neither because I don't take the challenges seriously. I agree that there's a big security challenge. I also agree that in terms of global competitiveness, Europe needs to raise its game. I agree on all these basic premises, but I do think the solution is somewhat differently. And the reason I'm saying that is because we're in a very different European Union now compared to when this project was conceived. The EU has been a success story in many ways. If you go back 30, 40 years, and if you would have told someone back then that, you know, in a few decades' time, we will have 28 countries happily trading with each other rather than shooting at each other, I think people will have, well, maybe not the shooting part, but certainly people, in terms of what the EU has achieved, a lot of people would not have believed you. So in that sense, in terms of extending the zone of trade, peace, and stability, the EU has been a success story. The question is, how do we maintain this? Well, I think it's a very different EU now compared to back then. We now have 28 very different countries, a very diverse European Union. You cannot run that club in the same way that you did when there were only six members. How in the world do we reconcile the need for more integration, perhaps within the Eurozone, with a very strong felt desire in countries like the UK, but also elsewhere, for less integration? How do you reconcile that? Well, my solution that would be to have a more flexible European Union, more based around the single market as its core. If we talked about core and periphery, I think the single market should be the EU's core, and much less of a political structure around it. A single market EU, but that will not prevent others from pressing ahead with more integration should they want to do so. But neither should those countries be able to inflict decisions on those countries that cannot pursue more integration for democratic reasons. So it's that kind of flexible structure I would look for. What would that do? And we can discuss exactly in detail what that would look like, but certainly it would not be a political project. It would not mean that you have to join the European single currency if you join the EU. I think that's, in my view, a very counterproductive proposition, that you have to join the euro if you join the EU. Yeah, I think it should be very much an open-ended question. But what would that sort of model achieve? Well, I think it would kill three birds with one stone. It would allow the current European Union to stay together, first of all, because it would allow the UK and maybe some other countries to stay in permanently by avoiding this choice between either joining the euro or leaving the EU. It would avoid the EU becoming a political extension of the Eurozone, which I think is very damaging. But it would also allow the Eurozone to integrate further. So that would be the second one. The third thing it will solve, and I will conclude on this because I know we have a very big panel, it would allow enlargement to continue. And in my view, it would allow Serbia to join much, much earlier than would have otherwise been the case. Why? Because, simply, when Greece joined the EU in the 80s, I think they had 9 accession chapters. Serbia has 35 it needs to negotiate with every individual country. And Tanja, I'm so sorry to say this, I don't want to rub it in, but every single country has, I think, a veto over the opening and the closing of every and each individual of those accession chapters. If you add the banking union to that, this hugely complex phenomenon known as the banking union, which is developing, and by the way, it's not entirely true, it's all intergovernmental, because we now have a new actor, the master of the universe, called the European Central Bank, which really did save the euro at the end of the day, actually. But if you add the banking union to that in its full shape and form, I think Serbia will join in 2050. I'm afraid to say, because it's too complex. So few countries can join that thing. That's why it's been so hard to negotiate it. So A single market type EU would lower the barrier to entry, but would still allow Serbia and potentially others to join the full benefits of the zone of trade and stability. It wouldn't be second-rate membership. On the contrary, you will be in there with fine people like the Swedes, my native country, the UK, Denmark, perhaps even Switzerland, Norway eventually. So it will be a good sort of single marketeer that would work for various different reasons. Concluding, I will finish on this. I do wish Serbia the best of luck in acceding to the European Union, because I genuinely believe, although there are plenty of problems in this world, or challenges rather, plenty of challenges in this world to which the solution is not necessarily more Europe. I think the Balkans, that's definitely where Europe will have a big role to play. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ülgen, in the neighborhood of the European Union, we actually see some dramatic and worrying events, even when it comes to peace and war and conflicts. And of course, here I think not only Ukraine, but Syria and countries of the Arab Spring occasionally, to some degree as well. Do you think European Union can play any significant role in securing peace in its neighborhood?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure to come back to Belgrade, a city with which I have a deep emotional connection, having spent a number of my younger years. But also, I'm doubly honored to be made a regular part of the success story that this forum has become. So really, many thanks. What a difference an hour makes. What I mean by that is that it takes about an hour to get from Istanbul to here. And the whole talk in Istanbul and across the country is actually about the issues that you've just addressed. Syria, Iraq, and the dreadful situation that whole neighborhood has become. So if you permit me, I will really focus my remarks on that particular region and EU's potential role, providing you with a somewhat critical assessment of what EU has failed to accomplish so far. And I will leave my good colleague and friend Ivan to deal with an equally simple region that the East has become. Now, many of the interactions that I've had with European policymakers in public fora like this basically paint a rather stark picture of what the EU has really been able to accomplish. And I really want to take as a yardstick one official document of the EU, which was its own security strategy. That was adopted in 2003. It aspired to give the EU a much bigger role in expanding peace and prosperity in the region and beyond. And when we look at the world today, and in particular EU's own neighborhood and where it stands, it really stands in stark contrast with the objectives that were set out in EU's own security strategy. Today, we can talk about an arc of instability extending all the way across from Syria and Iraq to Libya. We can talk about the palpable threats that some of those main parameters set out in that document, be it WMD, extremism, terrorism, and the flow of refugees. These threats have become very palpable. And from that standpoint, just from an objective, results-oriented approach, I would tend to submit that the EU's approach to its own southern neighborhood has been vastly ineffective, and that's a rather euphemistic term. Now, why is that? And I can venture a number of different explanations, but given the time limit, I will just concentrate on one. And that is, first of all, the EU has really failed to grasp a window of opportunity that was provided by the onset of the Arab Spring. Why a window of opportunity? Because the whole dynamic behind the Arab Spring actually upended the old order. It changed leaders. It changed power constellations. So there was a real window of opportunity to set the record straight, to innovate, to be more ambitious, more aggressive, and really to turn the EU into what it had failed to become until then, which was an effective foreign policy player on the ground, using its transformative power to steer the region into the right direction. Now, of course, with the deep pathological problems that we see surfacing from the region, I don't want to put, obviously, the whole burden on the EU. But nonetheless, my point is that whereas other countries have stepped in a big way, some for doing good, some for doing less good, and I would, for those who are interested in the role of external players, I would highly suggest you to consult an article that was published yesterday by Foreign Policy. It's entitled "The Case Against Qatar." And it's really deeply symptomatic about what those third countries have actually been able to accomplish for good or for bad in the region. But again, the EU you don't see the word EU in any of that. So countries like Qatar, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia have become deeply engaged with that region. Whereas the EU, in terms of what it has really demonstrated, was certainly a laggard. Now, why is that? My sort of argumentation here is to say that the whole EU approach of the neighborhood policy, which rests on conditionality, is predicated on the simple, but what is now seemingly a very erroneous assumption that democratic progress is going to be linear. It hasn't proven to be linear. On the contrary, democracy, what we have seen in this region, has become a much more volatile process, backtracking sometimes enormously. And therefore, once the strategy, however, has been solidified into this mental framework that thinks democracy is going to progress, that's basically what's more for more about. You are ready to commit more if there's progress more. Now, what do you do if there's no progress and actually if the whole dynamic is collapsing? There, the EU became totally unresponsive. It became just a bystander. It didn't know how to approach this dynamic in the region, and it left the whole region to some of the more detrimental impact that some of these third actors have come to display. So, in a way, the EU sidelined itself from the game by not being able to take stock of what was happening in this region, which was very far removed from the more perhaps naive, certainly well-meaning interpretation about what democratic progress is. Now, I don't want to champion the cause here for totally delinking EU engagement from democratic principles. That's not what I'm out here to do. But what I want to leave you with is that really European neighborhood policy, and especially its southern dimension, is in dire need of a re-engineering, of deep, thoughtful re-engineering, which to me means that you really have to take a more, really for a lack of a better word, holistic approach to this linkage between democracy and conditionality. It cannot anymore be about what we in the West understand in terms of what we mean by democracy promotion. It has to be about a more holistic approach, which would take into consideration economic development, women's empowerment, youth unemployment, rule of law, but not necessarily the core fundamentals that when we look at, elections, free and fair elections, multi-party democratic system, and so on and so forth. So I think the tinkering, and perhaps there is more of a need of tinkering, needs to take place. This, I think, is a good time as any with the change in leadership in Europe and its institutions. Really, I want to leave you with this dire need to go back to the drawing board about neighborhood policy, especially in southern dimension, that a new framework is absolutely needed, and which would have a new approach to this nexus between democracy and conditionality. Otherwise, if we don't do that, well, the result is quite clear, and I think that it would be wrong to expect any other outcome.
Thank you so much. Mr. Krastev, I mean, to continue somehow this topic, because it's one of your favorite, I mean, from what I understand in your own writings and analysis, I mean, would you agree that the border between the European Union and the neighborhood is also a border between democracy and alternatives? Or do you see penetration of alternatives into the European Union, just as we have seen, for example, the expansion of democratic practices outside of the European Union? Is this border now clear or blurred? Is it existent or non-existent?
Let me also start saying something nice about the Belgrade Forum, but not simply because they invited me, which is great by itself, but because I do believe that Belgrade is a good place to discuss what's happening in Europe these days. And this is because of a new relevance of the Yugoslav experience. And I'm not so simply talking about Ukraine. In a certain way, European order that came after 1989 was based on a very simple principle. Unlike after the World War I, we are not changing borders. And unlike World War II, we are not exchanging populations in order to secure borders. The idea was we are changing the nature of the borders. The borders basically can be easily crossed by people, by ideas, by capital. From this point of view, what happened in Crimea was important not because it changed the border of Ukraine, because it changed the nature of the border between the European Union and Russia. This is a different border, just to the extent we started with the destruction of the Berlin Wall. Now the Ukrainian government is suggesting building a wall on their border with Russia. So basically, from the Berlin Wall to the Crimean Wall, you have a period that ended. And I'm saying this because I do believe that there are 2 or 3 very important assumptions that are now questioned, and we should take them seriously. One is economic interdependence. The biggest idea behind the European order was that economic interdependence is not going to make possible one country to attack another country. What we saw in the case of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict is that, no, economic interdependence does not prevent one country attacking another country, but it makes more difficult to respond to this aggression. Because we are so much interconnected that responding has a very high cost. And now we are seeing a very interesting process which could be very detrimental to the European project. Now people all over Europe start to see much more the dark side of interdependence. Now people basically said, I want to be more independent. And it goes on different levels. On the level of governments, on the level of businesses, you have very much the securitization of the businesses. This is a process which is very, in my view, dangerous for the European Union because, in a certain way, interdependence is the name of the game in the European Union. The second thing which I do believe, and this is why Belgrade is a good place to look from. Listen, we have been telling the story of the last 25 years as simply the story of one project, the project of the expansion of the European Union and transformation of the European Union. But now, after the crisis, I do believe, and also what is happening in Turkey, happening in other places, you can see that this is not the only project. Honestly speaking, there are 4 different projects that happened in the last 25 years, and this is not true that Europe was a peaceful, uneventful place and you know better than anybody else. In the last 25 years, there were more new states being born in Europe than in any other place than Africa in the 1960s. We have more unrecognized states and frozen conflicts than in most of the other continents. So from this point of view, this idea of idyllic Europe of the last 25 years is slightly over-exaggerated. In a certain way, you have 4 projects which are very young, very vulnerable, and honestly speaking, all 4 of them in crisis. One is basically the transformed and expanding European Union. The other is the emergence of post-Soviet Russia. And you can see at least what I'm seeing as a logic of the Russian behavior is much more aggressive isolationism than simply a classical imperialism. Russia is afraid of the world of global borders because Russia is not competitive on economic but also on social level. But also you see Turkey, and Turkey is a great example because you have a process of democratization and marketization, and it ended with Turkey, which is more democratic and less pro-Western in its foreign policies. And then you have this state building happening in all these countries. And this state buildings was not a great success in many of them. And I do believe, and this is my last point, the biggest problem of the European order today is twofold. One is we discovered that European order is very distinctive than global order as such. It's not by accident that Chinese, Indians, and others were not so worried about Ukraine. For them, it was a European business. It was not a global business. They were much more worried by the Malaysian airplane than by what happened on the ground. But secondly, when you have these 4 projects, how these projects are going to play with each other is becoming very, very difficult question, because in a strange way, all of them are so vulnerable that they have the power to destabilize each other. And by the way, part of the message which Mr. Putin is sending to Europe is, you are destabilizing me, I can show you that I can destabilize you. I'm ready to fund anti-European parties. I'm ready basically to go in a separate deals with the member states. I'm going to do this and that. And from this point of view, I do believe it's a new game. And from this point of view, something ended in Crimea.
So much. Now we have time for quick comments. If anyone wants to comment on what other panelists have said, this is now the moment. But please keep it very short, minute, 2 more at most, and then we will include the audience. Would you like to say something?
Yeah, I would like to make a few real remarks. Periphery in terms of the treaty are Martinique and Réunion. Everything else is not periphery. That must be clear. But we should not say that we build core groups within the European Union. The treaty makes it very clear, for example, in the internal market. If you have an internal market, the law has to apply to everyone. Otherwise, the internal market will break. You have to say how much legislation you do or not. I think the Juncker Commission will propose less legislation as in the past. But you cannot destroy the legal unity of the internal markets. Then the legal market is finished. We have not free trade anymore because there are different conditions. And we have to see that also the Eurogroup. This is the avant-garde solution, as Jacques Delors, who has all invented this, has said. The euro is for all the countries. The euro is the currency of the European Union. But countries should go into that euro when they fulfill the conditions. So it's a step-by-step solution. And we have now 18 countries in it. And the political situation will increase the speed to join the euro. The fiscal compact, which is this one intergovernmental piece in legislation in the financial crisis, is now ratified by 27 countries. Schengen is another part of the avant-garde solution. Is only not signed at that time by Ireland and because of Britain. The question is not to create peripheral reasons. It's sometimes the situation that countries decide to become peripheral. It's that way around we have to see, and Britain is in that danger. And now from this situation, Persson, to say we have to have this flexible approach. We do not want to have this flexible approach. It's one unity with everyone the same right in that. And here we have to see that even the legislation in these financial packages done in this crisis are done by co-legislation with the European Parliament. The 6-pack, the 2-pack, everything. Stability and Growth Pact is decided by the European Parliament. That is not an intergovernmental approach. Even the fiscal compact with an intergovernmental treaty says the implementation by law has to be done with the European Parliament in the normal procedure of the communion approach. And I think this is very much important. And all this question of different groupings means that you have an intergovernmental approach, which means veto right, no move forwards. And you have in every details with 28 countries a veto, or between 12 countries a veto, nothing will go forward, and you have no democratic legitimation. Because intergovernmental approaches means that a few people decide. And it means also, if you have not this democratic decision-making procedure in our system, it will be the directorate of the big countries who say that is the way how to do. Therefore, I would like to warn smaller countries to go give up the communitarian method, because they will only strengthen the 3-4 big countries in the European Union and then will weaken them. The last remark. We have the possibility of a group around, but not within the European Union. This is, for example, the European Economic Area. If someone who wants to join the internal market and something like that, he should take that instrument. but they do not like to have circles within the European Union. In the European Union, everyone must have the perspective to become fully member in all its rights, and not a cherry-picking solution.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm sure there will be questions from the audience. I suggest we actually collect perhaps 2 or 3, and then if you could just please say who you are and to whom the question is directed. Yes, gentleman over there. Please. Yes? Yes, this gentleman here. Have you given up or what? Yeah, ask the question.
Sorry, I was just, yeah. I'm Alex Kaczarski from Communist University in Bratislava. I have a question for Professor Šiđanski. Professor, if I understood your argumentation correctly, you've been critical towards the Eastern Partnership for excluding Russia and thus contributing to to its drift to the East. Well, I think it's important to remember, in context of this argument, the background of Russia being offered a place in the European neighborhood policy framework and rejecting this offer because it did not want to be put in the same basket with other countries, because it wanted to seek a special relationship, a relationship on special terms with the EU. So my question to you would be, to what extent is it justified to speak of the policy of exclusion being pursued by the EU, or of a policy of self-exclusion, which comes from the other side? Thank you.
Thank you. We also have a question from the lady in the first row and the lady over in the fourth row, I think, over there. Yes. Yeah.
Hi, Sonja Stojanović Gajić, Belgrade Center for Security Policy. One impression I had from this panel is that there is consensus that the ideas EU stands for have become peripheral outside of the EU, but also, in a way, in EU. That's my conclusion, that we have not been debating about peripheries to the EU, but peripheral idea of the EU because of different assumptions being questioned. And my question is, what should be done about it, or what could be done about it? And if you could have an advice for small countries like Serbia that are formally still outside, what they can do about these big debates and values, sitting on a side, making proposals, and how to keep safe with these proposals. Thank you.
Yes, we have a question there. Yes?
Friends of Europe, thank you very much for a very interesting panel. My question is to Sinan. Sinan, I agree with you that the EU has actually lost a great opportunity to play a transformative role in the southern Mediterranean, if you like, the MENA region. But my question to you is, do you think Europe, the EU, actually has an understanding of what's happening there, of the different factions of Islam that are playing there, the power play, the idea that somehow Iran and Saudi Arabia can be brought into a regional dialogue over ISIS seems to me like really pigs will fly one day kind of thinking. I would like to have your idea on it. And then there's no money in the EU's southern neighborhood policy, not enough to play that role of change. And then there's no hope of membership. I mean, that is not on the agenda. So how does the EU pull in these countries into its value system without any of the tools that are required to do so? Thank you.
Okay, and the final question in this round from the gentleman in the back. And then we will, whoever wants to answer.
Thank you all very much for your insightful talk. My name is Mladen Mrdalj from Northeastern University in Boston. My concern is that this whole development with Ukraine has damaged anti-Putin opposition. And that anti-Putin opposition is a key, should have been a key to stabilize Russia and put it on the right track. Now, having two events that were strategically important, namely the push to make Ukraine closer, to bring Ukraine closer to the EU, came at the time when Germany has been a dominant power in the EU. Also, Germany was starting to be dominant after the Cold War, and also pushed for the independence, unilaterally pushed for the independence of Slovenia and Croatia, which led also to some bad effects. So my question for Mr. Brok is, shouldn't Germany just slow down and take some other people's consideration and counsel into account? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Who would like to answer the first of you? Yes, Professor Šiđanski.
Yes, it's of course the approach. Is it excluded or is it self-excluding and so on? Is the question. As I remembered, the discussion with Barroso, he told me what you said, that EU proposed to have it. But in the same basket, Russia is not Moldavia, is not Georgia. So we have to have a special negotiation to have in mind what is Russia. Because in this region, peace, development, cooperation cannot be with Russia. And what we did, and what is the principle everybody can decide. Yes, but reasonably decide. If you are dependent as Ukraine from Russia, from European Union, you have a minority, but big minority of Russophone, so you have to be reasonable in your decision. You cannot just decide, I am going on the other side. And especially, as you know, we have the crisis in the Union, and probably we are not the capacity to help really Ukraine. Is Ukraine a real democratic state? I am questioning all the changes by sort of revolution, the different, if you take the policy of the Prime Minister, is rather going to some sort of war against Russia, and the president is rather for some compromise. So who is deciding there? We have to wait. We cannot push this country to have a choice between the European Union and Russia. What will we do with the energy, with different type of interdependence we have? We have to build peace. If you want peace, you have to take Ukraine and Russia. Russia can guarantee in some way, like European Union, B2 and the others together. But to have Oriental, as we had partnership, I think it was an error. As it was an error to propose to Ukraine to choose this choice. It's too early. Ukraine is not really being democratic. It's not stabilized and so on. We move to Russia.
Thank you. Mrs. Miščević, sorry. Because
actually, I wanted to react on some of the statements here, but because of the time, I will try to answer and to pick up on Sonja's question. Debate on Europe and where are we? Actually, it will be very good to show ourselves as a part of that debate on future of Europe, because that would be the best possible way to show that we are not the periphery. What I'm saying, that each and every dialogue and debate, what is going to happen with the European Union integration, where to go deeper, wider, whatever you are going to discuss about this, should not go without the presence of the candidate and potential candidate country. Because it will be extremely difficult to discuss that without us. It will be twice as more costly, time-consuming, if the debate goes without those who are negotiating membership right now, without their insight and without their idea. This is actually to use the best possible capacity which we can offer, or should I say, a new energy that we are bringing to the process of European integration. That is extremely important. And that's why we always, whenever we do have the screening exercises discussing some of those chapters, and majority of them have actually now undergoing under the reform process in itself, like the environmental protection, like public procurement. We always ask our colleagues from the European Commission, please include us. whenever you are discussing the issue, because this is the best possible way, preparing ourselves for those things that are that we are going to face with once when we are member of the European Union. But this is not only in small parts of the acquis, it's on the bigger picture, what kind of Europe we would like to have or be member of. I'm not speaking about the finalité européenne for sure, because the debate is yet to come at one point, but where to go in the decade before us, or this is in front of us. And one issue, if you allow me, Mats mentioned something that we discussed when I was in London last time, when we discussed the issue of the very tough negotiations and the conditionality and the acquis. Yes, it is extremely difficult. It differs from all others. Negotiations, and I'm not speaking only on behalf of Serbia, I'm also speaking, and I hope that he will not have anything against it, my colleague, dear colleague from Montenegro, Ambassador Pejović, he is somewhere here in the public. It is extremely difficult to negotiate, but it's not difficult negotiating about those things that we are aware of, but about those things that we are not aware of because you, being EU and the member states, are not aware of. That is the biggest issue. Let me give you the example, Chapter 35 in our case. I'm sure that Michael is sick and tired of my questions regarding Chapter 35 technique, not the content, but the technique, how we are going to do it. And that's why I'm going back to the first issue. Please include us. Maybe we have some fresh ideas. Thanks.
Okay, Ivan Krastev, and then Michael Davenport, and then we'll take the questions and comments from the audience.
To address
yeah, sure.
two issues which in my view are very much related.
You as well.
One is exactly basically what has changed, and it very much connects also to our policy to Russia and to the opposition. Some years ago in Japan, they started to talk about something which they called Galapagos syndrome. And this refers to the following phenomena. Japanese cell phones are probably technologically the most advanced in the world. This is very much agreed by all experts. But they were so technologically advanced, and there was so much fitting to the specific demands of the Japanese customer that they never managed to have a global market. They never managed to cross, basically, the borders of Japan. I do believe something like this we are seeing with the European model and the European order. I do believe we have a very high standard and very important order, but if till yesterday we looked at it as very universal, now we're starting to see this as exceptional. And the problem is much more now how to defend our exceptionality than basically to believe that you can sell it to everywhere. I'm saying this because for a long period of time, the policy with respect to Russia was based on the fact that Mr. Putin does not speak on behalf of the Russian society. Unfortunately, at the moment, we cannot keep this illusion. It's not simply the opinion polls. Let's give you a data which probably you don't know. But now support for Putin is strongest in the urban centers that have been protesting against him 2 years ago. Why? Because basically Russia was pushing for give us values, the middle class. And he gave them values. But it was not the liberal values, but the values of the Russian nationalism. I'm saying this because we cannot base all our policies on the idea of the transformation of Russia. And secondly, and here Serbia is a great example. Also what transformation means. I was with the Balkan Commission. 2005, the biggest question that we faced was to meet the radicals or not, Mr. Vučić. And in a certain way, this was our biggest contribution to the Serbian development, that we decided to meet him. So you have a level of transformation, because Prime Minister Vučić is on one level the symbol of the transformation of Serbia, basically somebody who very much changed his views. On the other side, transforming the elites and transforming societies are not always the same. And my own country, Bulgaria, is a great example of this. The pervasive mistrust to institutions and others. And I do believe from this point of view, European Union simply should make a better work in distinguishing between its power of attraction and its transformative power. I do believe we have a very high power of attraction, and probably our transformative power is slightly more limited than we believe.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador Davenport.
Thank you very much. Just to pick up on 2 or 3 points that have been made, if I may. Firstly, on the Russian points and the point about damaging the opposition. Yes, of course, that's true. But that's also, I mean, foreign policy is very often driven by domestic policy, and the huge support that we're seeing for Russia's foreign policy inside Russia, and the support for the president in dealing with what's perceived as an outside threat is clearly one of the factors driving actions and policies. I think that policy towards Russia has over the years, and I have been involved in it myself, I think been marked by a very large amount of wishful thinking. There's been this belief somehow that there's an inevitability about Russia in due course accepting, taking on the same values that we were talking about, particularly in the previous panel. That's why I said earlier that I think that in looking at, I think it's fundamental for the EU and for European countries to look at the relationship with Russia and be realistic about what can be achieved. What can a real partnership there consist of, which is pursuing European interests. I think it's also another point. It's important to remember, and I'm chastened by what we were hearing about the failures of the EU in the southern neighbourhood. But you know, I think many of the points are very well made. But I think it is also important to remember that in terms of its foreign policy and foreign security policy and its projection, the European Union over the last few years has been almost at in a period of infancy when it comes to the European Action Service. It's still evolving, and member states have still had and still are having a huge impact. And where it is difficult for member states to agree a way forward, as is often the case with regard to some of the issues that are relevant to the Middle East, it's clearly difficult for the EU to pursue a coherent approach. I just must pick up on what Tanja said about knowing what you're negotiating about. The session on screening of Chapter 35 took place on the day after the opening of negotiations on the 22nd of January this year. You and I were there. Know, I think, the same amount in terms of what is known and what is not known. But clearly, by definition, because we're talking about a process towards comprehensive normalization, which is the goal, inevitably, a large number of steps are still ahead of us.
Okay, thank you. Sinan, Ülgen.
Yes, there was a direct question. I just want to answer that very shortly. I think the EU as an apparatus is well equipped on the side of both information gathering, but also analysis. That's not where I see the problem. The disconnect is in the policy side. What do you do with the information? What do you do with that analysis? That type of reaction has certainly been lacking. And I don't think that the problem is either on the material side. It's not about funding. And I'll give you two short examples why I think it's not about funding. One is when High Commissioner Ashton went to Tunisia for the first time after Ben Ali was kicked out of power. She entered the room with a financial commitment of 17 million euros. She was laughed out of the room. 17 million euros is what the EU has to commit to support democratic transition in Tunisia. The second example, Iraq today. Iraq has entered a very critical juncture. The international community was complaining about the sectarianism of Maliki. which has probably led to this, devilish entity that we've come to know as the Islamic Caliphate. But now there's been a change in government in Iraq. Now there is an opportunity for this more inclusive government to deliver, but they have to deliver fast. They have to deliver on basic needs, on electricity, 4 hours of shortages daily in Baghdad. A very low level of health services. This is an area where now we need to invest, and the EU needs to invest, to help with the new government to improve gradually, but fast as well, some of these basic levels of service. That's where the reaction on the EU side has really been lacking. It's just the DNA about responding to these changes on the ground is just not there. That's my problem with EU policymaking.
Just 1 minute. I just want to sort of, just to clarify that term and Brok, and I don't want to have sort of a discussion at this point because the rest of you fall asleep. But I'm not talking about a system of vetoes. I'm talking about new organizing principles that will allow for the internal cohesion of the EU to continue whilst also facilitate further enlargement. So that's what I'm saying. But I think the wider problem is that there's one template. The EU has at the moment one template in many ways, both for how it deals with integration internally, but also how it deals with its neighborhood. You cannot have a copy and paste solution to neighborhood policy with respect to Ukraine. It's just impossible for reasons that have been said. Similarly, you cannot have a one-size-fits-all or a copy and paste policy with respect to some countries within the European Union. I think that's what we need to look at. We need to have a more flexible approach, both internally and externally.
Okay, and then we have here the question in Germany, Mr. Brok, right?
Well, to say that we will have a flexible approach, but not within the European Union. And therefore, we have to say the Western Balkan states have the right to join, and we will fulfill this commitment. And Serbia will play in such a European Union an important role, because for the security and development of this region, Serbia is the most important country. But we cannot solve the question of the southern neighborhood by giving a membership perspective. It's ridiculous if we would like to do so. It would destroy the project of the European Union to do that, and therefore we have to see that this enlargement is only possible so far the integration capacity of the European Union is existing, which is part of the Copenhagen criteria. And for sure in the southern neighborhood we have done a lot of mistakes, but this is not solvable just by pouring money in. The European Union is not solving the problems all there, and I'm not quite sure in the last 12 months which role Turkey played, our NATO partner, in Syria and Iraq and all that questions, or in Egypt. I just put it as a question. Because I have no time to elaborate on it. But the question is Russia and Germany and Ukraine. Yeah. I think that Germany was always looking for the good relationship to Russia, at the one of the main countries of the European Union. It was Germany and France who stopped NATO enlargement in 2008 in the Bucharest summit, in order not to have a problem with Russia, and because there were certain commitments which were done. And we also not so fast in enlarging the European Union via the neighborhood countries. But that is very clear, and that's Mrs. Merkel's position. Here's a breach of international law. And a breach of international law should not be allowed. And it must be answered. You cannot go to daily business back if there's a breach of international law by military means. But on the other side, because it's a common interest, you look at both of Russia and the European Union to have a good partnership. It's even perhaps more in the interest of Russia and to look at the demographic and economic developments and the markets. I believe that if we can overcome the situation of the breach of international law, we should restart the negotiation of the second higher level of the partnership agreement, in order to come back to the strategic partnership and makes it possible. We want to have a good relationship to Russia. And we see it also that the decisions of Ukraine to go towards Europe are not aimed in order to have negative results for Russia. Therefore, it was also Germany to convince people in Brussels that we had negotiations, the three-party negotiations a few weeks ago about the asymmetrical implementation of the free trade agreement. And therefore, I think this is, I believe, a responsible position, but Ukraine must have and keep its right to go where it wants. That's the key question. Okay. We should never forget.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we are very close to finishing, to closing this panel. We have just one more comment from the audience here, and I think at that, if it is a question, it will be answered. If not, yeah, just briefly, and then we really, unless we really want our soup to get very cold, and everyone is here, knows that the lunch follows, then we need to really finish. Yeah. That's it.
Thank you very much. My name is Jelica Minić. I'm from the Forum for International Relations of the European Movement in Serbia. And maybe we can finish with the question. Is maybe Europe becoming a periphery in global terms? Because if you read papers about industrial renaissance in Europe, if you read papers on growing social inequalities, poverty, demographic trends, then Europe is in serious problems. But we are part of Europe and we share all problems with Europe. Second question is, European Union exported its economic crisis and all its neighborhood was heavily affected by European economic crisis because we are heavily dependent. I do not expect from you to answer these theses or questions or comments, but I think it's worthwhile to think about that because everything that we discussed now, if we put on the global scene, it looks like a small family discussion. Because global problems, and Europe is so small in global terms, and we are so small in Europe.
Okay, thank you so much. And I think we can probably, I think it's a very good idea actually to leave this question open for thinking and further discussion. There will be further panels on EU enlargement as well tomorrow and later today. I think we really need to finish with this. I would like to use this opportunity to thank all panelists wholeheartedly, and also once again organizers, including the Robert Bush Stiftung, who has been a partner in organizing this conference. So thank you once again, and thank you for your attention. Thank you.